Part 1. The Ancient World's Strange Sleep Habits. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Tonight we begin with something a little softer than the usual royal scandals or dynastic tragedies. We're gonna float gently into the world of sleep. Ancient sleep, to be precise. So, dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket, and let's drift into the slightly odd and surprisingly human bedtime routines of civilizations long gone. Sleep might seem simple, right? You lie down, you close your eyes, you snore, maybe quietly, maybe obnoxiously. But the ancients, well, they had some quirks. Some of them were practical, others were, frankly, weird. Some of them might make a modern sleeper consider investing in a good mattress, or maybe a sturdy helmet. Let's start with the Egyptians. Now, the Egyptians are famous for a lot of things: pyramids, mummies, and, of course, their obsession with the afterlife. But not everyone knows that the Egyptians were also oddly particular about sleep. They had this thing with beds. Wealthy Egyptians didn't just toss a mat on the floor. They had raised beds, sometimes with headrests shaped like an L, which apparently supported the neck in a very Egyptian elite way. It's almost cute, really, like they were lying down to dream about the next big pyramid project, or whether their cat would still be worshipped in the morning. Speaking of cats, sleep hygiene in Egypt sometimes involved animals. Cats were considered sacred, yes, but they also had a curious habit of curling up wherever they pleased. And if you happened to be a pharaoh, that could mean waking up with a paw in your face. Ancient Egyptians seem to accept this as a minor inconvenience, which makes sense, because if you spent your life being worshipped by everyone, the indignity of a small feline's paw probably doesn't sting too much. Moving east, the Greeks had their own interesting bedtime quirks. The average Athenian didn't have the luxury of Egyptian headrests, but they had other solutions. For example, the Greeks were big fans of segmented sleep. That's right, instead of the 8 hours straight we assume is normal, they often split their sleep into 2 chunks. The first sleep would happen after dusk, followed by a wakeful period in the middle of the night, and then a second sleep until dawn. During this middle period, people might read, write, pray, or apparently engage in philosophical debates. Imagine a sleepy Socrates in his nightshirt, muttering about virtue while half asleep. It's almost comforting, thinking that even the wisest philosophers had to fight the temptation to doze off in the middle of the night. And yes, there was probably some gossip involved, because why not? Ancient humans were humans, after all. The Romans, who had a tendency to adopt and improve everything Greek, also had a fascination with sleep, but they were even more extravagant about it. Wealthy Romans would have sleeping rooms designed specifically for optimal relaxation. The furniture was low and cushioned. The rooms often faced gardens to catch the cool evening breeze, and naturally, they had servants standing by. Now, the role of servants in Roman sleep is a little funny. Not funny in a ha-ha sense, more in a oh, of course sense. Some slaves were responsible for waking their masters. Others were in charge of ensuring that no one snuck in during the night to steal anything, or, commit minor political sabotage. Because why risk a coup while you're dreaming of wine and togas? Romans also had an interesting take on napping. They called it the meridian rest, or siesta, if you want to borrow the Spanish version. Around midday, it was socially acceptable, even encouraged, to lie down and snooze for a bit. Merchants, soldiers, and philosophers alike seem to take this quite seriously. Some historians speculate that the Romans may have actually invented the concept of the power nap, although with less of a trendy Instagram aesthetic and more of a "please don't drool on the senator's toga" vibe. Now, let's drift over to the Celts because, well, why not? Celtic sleep habits are less documented, largely because they didn't have as much written record as the Romans or Egyptians. But archaeological evidence suggests they were a little communal. Think longhouses filled with entire families, sometimes including extended relatives and livestock. It was not unusual to find humans and animals sharing the same sleeping space. Imagine drifting off while a cow shifts beside you. Comforting? Maybe. Aromatic? Definitely. The Chinese of the ancient dynasties had sleep quirks worth noting too. They were meticulous about timing, position, and environment. Some Chinese texts recommend sleeping with the head pointing east, because apparently energy flows better that way. Others insisted on silk sheets to prevent tangling hair, or possibly to prevent the nightmares of entangled spirits. And yes, certain emperors even had attendants whisper in their ears to ensure they dreamt good dreams, which seems both soothing and mildly terrifying. It's not just about position or timing either. The ancients had peculiar ideas about sleep behavior. For example, snoring was widely recognized as a problem, but the solutions ranged from cute to bizarre. Some people tied weights to their jaws, others allegedly placed garlic in strategic positions nearby, and some, in Egypt again, relied on incantations. Basically, snoring was treated as both a nuisance and occasionally a supernatural warning. So next time your partner nudges you, remember, ancient humans had it way more ritualized. Now, before we float on to other regions, let's pause with one of my personal favorite ancient sleep stories, the Roman Emperor Augustus. Augustus, in his quest for order and perfection, apparently had very strict sleep habits. He went to bed at a precise hour, often in the company of his guards. Not for security, though that was a bonus, but because he believed disciplined sleep contributed to disciplined governance. Some sources suggest he even monitored the sleeping arrangements of his family to ensure no one was wasting night hours. Because nothing says calm and loving family life than auditing your child's pillow alignment. Speaking of children, the ancient world had interesting views on infant sleep. Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans all seem to accept that babies were tiny, unpredictable night terrors. Cradles were often simple, but some had protective charms or inscriptions meant to ward off evil spirits while the baby napped, which is both sweet and slightly alarming. Imagine a soft lullaby accompanied by, "Please, protective gods, stop the child from rolling into the pottery shards." So if we summarize so far, Egyptians had elaborate beds and sacred cats, Greeks segmented sleep and philosophized midnight, Romans napped strategically, sometimes with servants making sure nothing bad happened, Celts slept communally with animals, and the Chinese were deeply concerned with energy flow and dream quality. Oh, and Augustus just micromanaged it all. But there's a final point before we float off to other regions, the ancient hygiene and sleep. Most civilizations were aware that sleep could be affected by comfort, warmth, and cleanliness, but the methods were variable. The wealthy might bathe before bed, often with oils and perfumes, while the unfortunate, well, they relied on routine, luck, and sometimes straw mattresses. In other words, being clean while sleeping has always been a marker of privilege. Ancient humans knew this, and they acted accordingly. And yet, despite all these systems, the ancients also indulged in some surprisingly modern behaviors. They stayed up too late. They worried about insomnia. They relied on ritual, routine, and sometimes mild superstition to get some rest. And sometimes they just gave up and slept wherever they could, dreaming of more manageable days, or perhaps imagining that their cats wouldn't judge them for a little extra snoring. So, if you're lying in bed tonight, cozy and warm, consider the long line of humans before you who had their own sleep quirks. Some were elegant, some were slightly ridiculous, and some were just plain uncomfortable. But we share the same basic need. And sometimes it's the shared strangeness that's most comforting. All right, let's gently move on to the next layer of weird ancient sleep, The Romans again, but this time focusing on their more eccentric night routines. Because you haven't truly experienced sleep history until you've seen senators and generals trying to optimize naps while plotting the next conquest, or maybe just trying not to drool on marble floors.
All right, if you've managed to stay cozy and awake so far, let's float forward a few centuries and explore the medieval world. The Middle Ages, often imagined as knights, castles, and dramatic sword fights, actually had a lot of curious sleep habits. Not necessarily glamorous, not necessarily dangerous, just peculiar enough to make you grateful for your memory foam mattress. First, let's talk about beds. Medieval beds were often more symbolic than practical. Nobles would have tall, draped beds, often with heavy curtains meant to keep out drafts, or perhaps nosy servants. Some beds had wooden frames so elaborate they could almost qualify for furniture museums. Of course, the mattresses were often stuffed with straw or feathers, which, depending on your luck, might have been clean or might have included a surprise breakfast guest, because medieval housekeeping was variable. It wasn't unusual for families, even wealthy ones, to share beds. Kings and queens, princes and princesses sometimes slept in close quarters with their children or attendants. This was partly practical. Castles were cold, drafty, and sometimes dangerous. But it also meant that dynastic awkwardness was baked directly into the sleeping arrangements. Imagine a little prince trying to nap while a chambermaid softly snores nearby. Or worse, while a royal cousin coughs into the pillow. Comfort, medieval style, was relative. And speaking of royalty, some kings and queens were famously particular about bedtime rituals. Take King Charles VI of France, sometimes called Charles the Mad. He had episodes of severe mental illness that affected his sleep in strange ways. During one period, he reportedly refused to sleep in a bed at all and wandered around in the dark, convinced he was made of glass. Yes, glass. So his attendants had to pad the hallways and sometimes even follow him around to make sure he didn't shatter himself. Sleep, in this case, was less about rest and more about survival. Then there's Queen Christina of Sweden, who, despite her fame as a strong, intelligent ruler, had a very specific nighttime routine. She reportedly slept in a large, dark room with multiple mattresses stacked high, as if she were preparing for a gentle royal avalanche. Candles were lit, attendants whispered in hushed tones, and she often spent hours reading or meditating before finally surrendering to sleep. It's almost comforting to think that even powerful monarchs needed elaborate sleep rituals. And perhaps a mattress fort. We can't skip the English royals, of course. Take Henry VIII, famous for, well, everything, but his sleep habits are telling. He had a massive bed, naturally, because why not? But he was also known to indulge in unusual pre-bedtime routines. He enjoyed a kind of early modern comfort food right before sleep. Wine, rich meats, and desserts, all while discussing politics with his advisors. Modern sleep experts might frown at this, but Henry, as history notes, was far more interested in indulgence than insomnia. And then there's the slightly tragic case of medieval children. Royal children were often tucked into beds that were far too elaborate for comfort, with high sides to prevent falls and attendants close by. Yet, despite these precautions, many slept poorly because medieval medicine, superstition, and parental anxiety combined in curious ways. If a child sneezed in the night, it could be interpreted as an omen. If they dreamt of a wolf, or worse, a rival prince, attendants might whisper warnings or adjust the blankets. In other words, sleep was often stressful, even in a royal cradle. But not all sleep oddities were about beds. They were about positions. Medieval Europeans had ideas about optimal sleeping posture. That might seem comical today. For instance, sleeping upright was sometimes recommended for people with respiratory issues or to ward off nightmares. People might stack pillows behind their backs or prop their heads at sharp angles. Some physicians even suggested specific arm positions, because apparently your elbow placement could influence your humors, which, as you can imagine, made middle-of-the-night tossing and turning a high-stakes affair. Now let's drift over to another slightly awkward topic: co-sleeping arrangements among nobles. In the late medieval period, it was not unusual for attendants to share beds with their masters to prevent thieves, or ill-omened spirits, from disturbing sleep. Sometimes multiple adults and children shared a single large bed. So imagine a royal evening. A king here, a queen there, a child tucked between them, and perhaps a trusted servant guarding the doorway. Cozy, perhaps. Slightly claustrophobic? Definitely. Meanwhile, across Europe, the aristocracy developed an interesting approach to napping. The siesta-like afternoon rest persisted, but it was often accompanied by ritual. In France, for example, some noble households maintained a quiet period in the early afternoon when servants whispered, animals were hushed, and anyone attempting a conversation was gently shooed away. The goal was simple: a short restorative nap to maintain composure during the rest of the busy day. One imagines this as the medieval equivalent of do not disturb signs, albeit far less standardized.
Part 3. Eccentric monarchs and sleep in early modern Europe. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You are now officially an expert in gently floating through the history of sleep. Tonight, we're going to drift even further into the oddly specific, occasionally tragic, and always slightly absurd world of royal and elite sleep habits in early modern Europe. Let's start with the Habsburgs. Now, when we talk about the Habsburgs, we tend to focus on their political influence, arranged marriages, and jawlines that could only be described as genetically committed. But the Habsburgs also had some curious bedtime habits, probably because they spent so much time indoors supervising dynastic paperwork. Some members were said to sleep with multiple pillows to keep their heads upright, as if vertical slumber could somehow improve posture, or perhaps make breathing easier for their famously prominent jaws. Other Habsburgs had attendants meticulously arrange their blankets, sheets, and nightcaps, because heaven forbid a royal wrinkle disturb their dreams. Speaking of dreams, the Habsburgs were not alone in believing that sleep could influence destiny. Many early modern monarchs were obsessed with omens, prophecies, and the subtle signs of the night. Some believed that the direction of their pillow, the number of blankets, or the presence of a sleeping companion could affect not only rest, but political fortune. Imagine being woken at 3 a.m. by a servant insisting that you adjust your pillow to prevent rebellion. Modern sleep science would frown, but in the 17th century, it was considered preventative governance. Now, let's float over to Louis XIV of France, the Sun King. Louis was famous for a lot of things: his palace, his art collection, and his very particular daily routine. But his sleep habits were a mix of ritual and spectacle. Louis would often rise at a very precise hour, surrounded by courtiers, and retire at night with a similarly orchestrated ceremony. His attendants would dress him for bed, prepare the room, and ensure that no unexpected drafts disturbed the Sun King's slumber. It's almost impressive, really, or mildly exhausting, depending on whether you are Louis or a courtier. Louis XIV's obsession with routine also included pre-bedtime reflection, a form of journaling or meditation intended to soothe the mind before sleep. He reportedly spent hours reviewing state matters, arranging correspondence, and reflecting on court life before finally surrendering to rest. One can imagine that even the most opulent bedroom cannot entirely mask the existential weight of absolute monarchy. But at least the curtains were heavy and the sheets perfectly tucked. Meanwhile, across the Channel, England had its own set of eccentrics. Charles II, known for indulgence and charm, had rather more relaxed sleep habits. While he maintained a bed befitting a king, he was not as regimented as Louis XIV. He preferred lounging late into the night, sometimes engaging in conversation, sometimes simply dozing while attendants hovered nearby. Sleep for Charles was less ceremony, more personal indulgence, with occasional distractions like wine or late-night politics. His approach reminds us that even monarchs can have very human, very inconsistent sleep routines. Let's pause for a moment to consider the impact of inbreeding on sleep, which is less glamorous but oddly relevant. Many European dynasties practiced generations of consanguineous marriages, partly to maintain dynastic control and wealth. The Habsburg jaw is the poster child for this. But there were also sleep-related consequences. Some inbred monarchs suffered from physical deformities or neurological issues that could make resting comfortably a challenge. For example, limited mobility, chronic pain, or even seizures could affect their ability to sleep normally. Their attendants sometimes had to adjust pillows, elevate limbs, or gently prop the monarch into a particular position for hours.
Sleep, in this case, became a delicate choreography. Then there's Peter the Great of Russia, who seems to have been awake more than asleep for most of his life. Peter had an almost legendary disregard for comfort. While other monarchs carefully curated their sleep environment, Peter would often sleep on simple straw pallets, in harsh conditions, or even outdoors during inspections of shipyards or fortifications. He reportedly sometimes went days with minimal sleep, napping only briefly before returning to administrative or military duties. Peter's approach illustrates a kind of radical utilitarianism. Sleep is not a luxury, it is a brief, functional pause before the next exertion of power. Contrast that with Maria Theresa of Austria, who maintained precise bedtime routines for herself and her children. She was famous for organizing her family's sleep schedule with military-like precision. Her children had assigned bedtime hours, specific pillow arrangements, and attendants ensuring that no one snuck extra snacks or stayed up reading forbidden books. Sleep here is almost a mechanism of control, a reflection of the larger dynastic project. You could almost hear her thinking, if I can organize their sleep, I can organize the empire. And then there are the bizarre, borderline obsessive rituals. Frederick the Great of Prussia reportedly used cold baths before bed to refresh the mind and body. Catherine the Great of Russia enjoyed extended reading before sleep, sometimes accompanied by attendants holding candles or whispering in her ear. These rituals, while eccentric, reflect a broader theme. Sleep was a carefully managed domain, a personal and political stage where even small deviations could feel catastrophic, or at least inefficient. Not all sleep habits were practical or functional, of course. Some were comfort-driven in a slightly absurd sense. Elizabeth I of England reportedly slept with a small pillow under each elbow, perhaps to maintain posture, perhaps for superstition, or perhaps just because she liked it. The point is that even seemingly trivial adjustments to sleeping arrangements were taken seriously in royal circles. And attendants, of course, had to comply. Imagine standing by all night to ensure the Queen's elbows remained perfectly cushioned. Then there's the issue of illness and sleep, which was particularly significant in dynastic families. Fever, smallpox, and other diseases were constant threats. Beds were sometimes improvised to maximize airflow or minimize drafts. Some monarchs slept in separate chambers to prevent contagion, while others insisted on sharing rooms for moral or symbolic reasons. Sleep became both a medical strategy and a reflection of hierarchy, a delicate balance between comfort, ritual, and survival. It's worth noting that many monarchs also believed in the connection between dreams and destiny. Charles VI's glass delusions aside, others interpreted dreams as omens. Some kept dream journals. Others had attendants read their dreams aloud in the morning, decoding possible political ramifications. Sleep was no longer just a pause, it was a medium, a subtle channel through which the future might whisper. It's almost sweet, in a slightly tragic way, to consider monarchs lying awake, pondering the implications of their own subconscious. Meanwhile, commoners were not entirely immune to ritualized sleep. Across Europe, families followed seasonal rhythms, aligning sleep with daylight, agricultural demands, and social obligations. Communal sleeping was common, and temperature, drafts, and bedding materials were constantly negotiated. Not quite as dramatic as royal bedrooms, but human comfort and the occasional strategic nap remained essential. One more interesting dimension: pets and sleep. Monarchs often slept with animals, dogs, cats, even monkeys in some cases. Animals were thought to provide comfort, ward off spirits, or simply serve as companions. The downside, of course, was snoring, fur in the sheets, and occasionally more chaotic disruptions. Still, the presence of animals shows a kind of continuity. Humans have long valued sleep companions, even in the most structured, ceremonial environments. So, to summarize part 3, early modern Europe's sleep was a mix of ritual, eccentricity, and control. Monarchs and dynastic families approached rest as both a necessity and a political instrument. Inbreeding sometimes complicated comfort. Illness, superstition, and the fear of omens infused the night with subtle tension. Attendants, pets, multiple mattresses, carefully arranged pillows, and prescribed routines all contributed.
Part 4. Sleep gadgets, insomnia, and elite oddities in the 18th and 19th centuries. All right, if you're still awake, and I trust you are, wrapped in blankets slowly sinking into comfort, let's drift into the 18th and 19th centuries. The world had changed a bit by then. Cities were bigger, science was emerging, and elites were experimenting with all sorts of ways to make sleep more elaborate, or, depending on your perspective, more absurd. One of the first things to note is the rise of sleep gadgets. The wealthy were obsessed with comfort, which now included things like adjustable bed frames, feather-stuffed mattresses in multiple layers, and pillows shaped to the exact curvature of one's neck. Some of these devices seem almost modern, memory foam without the foam, if you will. Others were a little stranger. For example, some 18th century Europeans believed that sleeping with a cool metal plate on the forehead could prevent night sweats or fever. Whether it worked or merely caused mild discomfort is not well documented, but the belief persisted. Then there's the notion of structured sleep. Unlike the segmented sleep of the Greeks or the siestas of the Romans, elites in the 18th and 19th centuries often pursued rigid schedules. Some doctors recommended going to bed at the exact same time each night and waking at precisely the same time in the morning. This was part medical advice, part social control. Monarchs, aristocrats, and the wealthy embraced this with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some succeeded. Many did not. Insomnia became a more recognized issue in this era, especially among the intellectual and elite classes. Thinkers, writers, and rulers often lay awake for hours, worrying about philosophy, politics, or, frankly, trivialities like whether their gloves were properly lined. Physicians began prescribing remedies, herbal teas, opiates in measured doses, warm baths, and, occasionally, elaborate pillow arrangements to encourage proper circulation. Sleep was increasingly medicalized, analyzed, and ritualized. Let's drift to France for a moment. The aristocracy of pre-revolutionary France treated sleep as both a necessity and a luxury. Bedchambers were designed with heavy drapery, canopies, and curtains to trap heat and minimize drafts. Servants were on hand to fluff pillows, adjust blankets, and ensure that the royal or noble sleeper did not overheat or underheat. Some nobles even had attendants whose sole purpose was to wake them gently, preferably without startling them or disturbing their carefully arranged sheets. Efficiency, comfort, and ceremony, all wrapped into one. Across the Channel, England had its own sleep trends. By the late 18th century, four-poster beds were almost ubiquitous among the upper classes, often draped with heavy curtains. Bedtime reading became popular, particularly novels and philosophical treatises. Some aristocrats slept with their pets, dogs, cats, sometimes even monkeys, while others employed attendants to ensure that their chamber was kept quiet and temperate.
Some physicians of the time even recommended placing a gentle breeze in the room, believing that fresh air promoted deeper sleep. One wonders if the occupants were ever actually able to feel the breeze under all those blankets. Sleep hygiene was increasingly emphasized during this period. Clean sheets, temperature control, and regulated bedtime rituals were all considered essential. The wealthy were often advised to avoid heavy meals before bed, although many ignored this in favor of indulgence, drinking wine or eating late evening desserts. Some prescribed a short walk before bedtime, while others experimented with mild sedatives. Sleep became not just a pause in the day, but a carefully curated activity. And then there were the more eccentric practices. Certain elites were obsessed with the correct sleeping position. Side, back, prone. Each had proponents and supposed health benefits. Some even had beds designed to enforce a particular position, propping limbs with pillows or restraining sheets in subtle ways. History books are filled with curious accounts of the elderly aristocrat meticulously arranged in bed, while attendants ensured that no movement disturbed the supposed therapeutic alignment. Comfort, in this case, bordered on performance art. Pets remained a consistent companion to the wealthy sleeper. Dogs and cats were common, yes, but sometimes monkeys, birds, or even exotic animals shared the chamber. They were believed to provide companionship, spiritual protection, or simply emotional comfort. The downside, naturally, was noise, fur, and occasional chaos, but for the elite, these were minor concerns compared to the benefit of perceived tranquility and ritual. Sleep, during this era, was also a reflection of personality. Some rulers, like Catherine the Great's descendants, maintained precise schedules, with lights out at exact times, attendants checking in periodically. Others, like certain Romantic-era intellectuals, embraced irregular sleep, staying up late with books, candles, and philosophical musings, only to nap intermittently during the day. The spectrum of sleep habits expanded considerably, reflecting both individual eccentricities and evolving cultural norms. We can also note the growing understanding of dreams. Aristocrats and intellectuals often kept dream journals, believing that their nocturnal visions could reveal subconscious truths, political inclinations, or even personal failures. Some went so far as to analyze these dreams with attendants or household philosophers, decoding hidden meanings or omens. Sleep was no longer just rest, but a stage for self-reflection, spiritual inquiry, and occasionally mild anxiety. The 19th century also introduced new sleep-related technologies. Feather beds gave way to more sophisticated spring mattresses. Pillows were standardized and sometimes even shaped ergonomically. Nightcaps, once purely decorative, became functional items meant to retain warmth. Some physicians suggested weighted blankets, warm baths, or even early forms of white noise, though, admittedly, their version of noise was largely the gentle hum of attendants or the rustling of curtains. Yet for all this attention to comfort, sleep remained precarious. Illness, anxiety, and the demands of dynastic responsibility often disrupted the most elaborate routines. Monarchs, aristocrats, and elites still suffered insomnia, restless nights, and sometimes bizarre sleep behaviors. Some walked in their sleep, others talked aloud. Some even conducted small political deliberations from bed. The boundary between sleep, wakefulness, and duty blurred in the lives of the privileged. Meanwhile, the general population continued more pragmatic habits.
Communal sleeping persisted in rural areas, shared bed-in with family or animals remained common, and sleep was dictated largely by seasonal rhythms and labor needs. Drafts, cold floors, and simple pallets were the reality for most. Yet even here, humans developed rituals. Priestly prayers, small gestures to avoid nightmares, and sometimes carefully crafted naps in the middle of the day. Sleep, regardless of social status, retained its mysterious, indispensable quality. And so, as the 19th century drew to a close, sleep among the elite became increasingly ritualized, medicalized, and scrutinized. Monarchs and aristocrats maintained precise bedtime schedules, attendants curated every aspect of the sleeping environment, and the study of sleep as both a physiological and psychological phenomenon gained attention. Dreams were recorded, positions were enforced, and comfort devices proliferated. Sleep had evolved into a carefully managed microcosm of life itself. And by now, if you've been gently floating through this narrative, you might feel both strangely enlightened and very sleepy. And perhaps that's the point. Human sleep, from ancient Egypt to 19th century Europe, has been simultaneously simple and absurd, functional and ceremonial, comforting and slightly comical. Monarchs micromanaged their nights, elites designed elaborate beds, and ordinary humans improvised with what they had. Yet across centuries, one thread remains constant: the universal desire for rest. And so as you drift toward your own
Part 5. Dynastic insomnia and the peculiar sleep of late 19th, early 20th century elites. Now, if you're still awake, let's drift gently into the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This is a period when electricity began to creep into bedrooms, and modern science started to take an interest in sleep itself. Yet, despite these advances, elites remained just as eccentric, just as meticulous, and just as weirdly invested in their nightly rest as any Habsburg or Sun King before them. Take Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom, for example. Victoria was famously disciplined, and this extended to sleep. She reportedly maintained a strict bedtime schedule, often retiring early and rising early. But her sleep environment was unique. Rooms were dark, heavily curtained, and frequently chilled by attendants who believed that cooler temperatures improved health. Candles were lit sparingly to preserve the calm, and servants were expected to keep the room silent. Even the slightest creak might warrant intervention. Comfort was paramount, but it came with an invisible army of watchful eyes. Victoria's children also inherited this meticulous approach to sleep. Many were required to adhere to regimented routines, exact times for lights out, strict rules for bedtime reading, and detailed pillow and blanket arrangements. Sleep was not only a biological necessity, it was a subtle instrument of control and moral training. There's something almost quaintly authoritarian about a household in which a child's elbow placement might be scrutinized before lights out. Across Europe, similar obsessions persisted. The last Russian Tsars, Nicholas II and Alexandra, maintained strict routines. Alexandra in particular was sensitive to illness and superstition. She sometimes slept with multiple attendants nearby, ensured precise room temperatures, and even monitored the bedding arrangements herself. Their children, like their parents, were inducted into this highly regulated system. Sleep was carefully observed, with the belief that even minor disturbances could affect health, temperament, or, heaven forbid, dynastic stability. Meanwhile, the Austro-Hungarian Habsburgs, who had been famous for inbreeding, continued to struggle with sleep-related complications caused by hereditary conditions. Some family members reportedly had difficulty maintaining comfortable positions. Others required attendants to help prop limbs or adjust pillows to prevent circulatory issues. Sleep for these dynasties became not just rest, but a medically and logistically managed procedure. Attendants needed knowledge, precision, and patience. In France, aristocrats of the Belle Époque also developed curious sleep habits. They embraced the comfort of feather mattresses, multiple layers of blankets, and precisely stacked pillows. Some even employed servants to regulate nighttime temperatures or adjust the curtains periodically. Pre-bedtime rituals, lavender baths, warm drinks, gentle music, became widespread among the elite. It was a mix of comfort, superstition, and early modern wellness practices. The goal was simple: optimal sleep with as little disruption as possible. Interestingly, some intellectuals and artists of the early 20th century embraced insomnia as a kind of badge of honor. Writers like Marcel Proust or Friedrich Nietzsche reportedly spent nights awake, reading, writing, or contemplating existence. They sometimes napped in the afternoon, but maintained unusual schedules. For them, sleep was not a carefully curated ritual. It was a fleeting interlude between creativity and rumination, and perhaps a quiet rebellion against the increasingly regimented sleep practices of elites and monarchs. Then there's the technological side of late 19th, early 20th century sleep. With electricity becoming more common, bedrooms were brighter, more controlled, and sometimes more intrusive. Clockwork alarms emerged, while specialized bed frames and spring mattresses proliferated. Some physicians advocated for scientific sleeping positions, recommending precise alignments of head, torso, and legs. Weighted blankets, previously a fringe notion, began to gain favor for their supposed calming effects. Sleep in this era became both a domestic science and a stage for minor eccentricities. The obsession with dreams also persisted. Elite individuals often kept detailed dream journals, sometimes hiring attendants or psychologists to interpret them. Dreams were seen as windows into health, temperament, or destiny. Some aristocrats consulted specialists if they suffered recurring nightmares, while others experimented with herbal teas, mild sedatives, or even hypnotic suggestion to encourage better dreams. Sleep was now part science, part superstition, and part self-analysis. Let's not forget the pets. Monarchs, aristocrats, and intellectuals alike continued to sleep with animals: dogs, cats, birds, sometimes even monkeys. These companions were believed to provide comfort, spiritual protection, or simply emotional support. The downside, naturally, was occasional chaos in the sheets, fur on clothing, or minor disturbances in the night. But for the elite, these were minor inconveniences compared to the psychological benefits. Sleep was both practical and ceremonial, and pets played a surprisingly central role. Finally, there's the cultural shift. By the early 20th century, society at large began to recognize the importance of sleep, hygiene, and regular schedules. Yet the elite retained their eccentricities. Beds became taller, mattresses more elaborate, rooms more temperature-controlled, and bedtime rituals more intricate. Some embraced gadgets, others relied on superstition, some attempted to manipulate dreams, and some simply refused to conform, staying awake for hours lost in thought, philosophy, or politics. So, to summarize Part 5, by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, sleep among the elites was a complex ritual blending technology, superstition, hygiene, and eccentric personal habits. Monarchs and aristocrats micromanaged not just their own sleep, but often that of their family, attendants, and even their pets. Intellectuals and artists experimented with insomnia and unconventional schedules. Across Europe, the fascination with optimal rest, dreams, and personal comfort created an era of curious, highly specific, and sometimes comically obsessive sleep practices. And there we have it,
From ancient Egyptians to early 20th century aristocrats, sleep has always been a strange, human, and oddly ceremonial affair. Monarchs micromanaged pillows, intellectuals stayed awake plotting ideas, dreams were analyzed, pets were cherished, and attendants hovered in the shadows. Comfort was pursued obsessively, yet sleep remained as unpredictable as ever. So, tonight, as you nestle into your own bed, surrounded by modern mattresses, climate control, and perhaps a small furry companion, consider the lineage of human sleep that stretches back millennia. From draped beds in medieval castles to feather-stuffed mattresses of the Belle Epoque, humans have always been fascinated, obsessed over, and occasionally ruined by the mysterious act of rest. Sleep, after all, is the great equalizer. Simple, universal, and wonderfully uncontrollable. And now we can slowly close our eyes, let the weight of centuries of sleep rituals wash over us, and gently drift into our own dreams. Good night, and sleep well.
Part 6. Modern Echoes and Reflections on Historical Sleep. If you've been drifting along with us through ancient Egypt, medieval castles, and opulent 19th century bedrooms, congratulations! You've now seen sleep as a historical spectacle, a ritual, and occasionally a minor tragedy. But let's float gently into the modern era and consider how these centuries of peculiar habits still whisper in our bedrooms today. Even now, many of the things we do for sleep have echoes in history. Adjustable beds, multiple pillows, and temperature control are standard in many households, but they have their antecedents in the feather-stuffed, multi-layered mattresses of the Belle Epoque and the carefully positioned pillows of the Habsburgs. Humans have long believed that precise sleeping arrangements can improve rest, or at the very least prevent minor catastrophes like bad posture or restless nights. Dreams, too, remain a fascination. Modern sleep studies, dream journals, and even smartphone apps that claim to analyze REM cycles are the technological descendants of 18th and 19th century dream journals. Just as aristocrats once sought meaning in the nocturnal wanderings of their subconscious, many of us today track our dreams, hoping to glean insight, amusement, or at least a reason for that weird dream about falling into a vat of spaghetti. History shows us that this impulse is timeless. The presence of animals in the bedroom, though perhaps less dramatic today, also has historical continuity. Cats, dogs, and other pets continue to provide companionship, comfort, and mild nocturnal chaos. The Egyptians, Romans, and modern humans all recognize the same basic truth. A companion in the night is worth a little inconvenience. Snoring, paw on the face, fur in the sheets, these have always been the cost of emotional comfort. Even insomnia remains familiar. Whether Peter the Great wandering shipyards, Romantic-era intellectuals scribbling notes at 3 a.m., or modern thinkers scrolling endlessly on screens, the struggle to sleep has always been part of human life. The techniques change, meditation, sleep apps, weighted blankets, but the human need for rest and the frustration of being unable to find it remain constant. Looking back, the extravagance of royal sleep rituals may seem almost absurd. Attendants, elaborate mattresses, multiple layers of blankets, precisely timed bedtime routines, it's all a testament to how seriously humans have taken sleep, even when it borders on theatrical. Yet there's a quiet beauty in it too. Across time, humans have valued rest, comfort, and the mysterious restorative power of sleep. We've tried to control it, ritualize it, analyze it, and occasionally obsess over it. And yet, sleep in the end remains delightfully uncontrollable. Modern sleep culture, weighted blankets, memory foam, sleep tracking devices, and white noise machines, is in some ways a continuation of centuries of experimentation.
We might be more comfortable, more scientific, or more data-driven than the Habsburgs or Belle Epoque aristocrats, but we still share their fascination with optimizing something fundamentally simple: rest. And so, as we reach the gentle close of our historical exploration, consider this. For thousands of years, humans have sought to master sleep, and yet sleep has always remained just out of reach. It is at once a biological necessity, a personal ritual, and a mirror of human eccentricity. From Pharaohs' headrests to monarchs' multi-layered mattresses, from dream journals to modern apps, sleep has remained a canvas for our desires, fears, and idiosyncratic qualities. Tonight, as you lie down, perhaps surrounded by modern comforts that would have astonished the most pampered monarchs, take a deep breath and remember the lineage of rest. The ancients, the medievals, the early modern elites, they all slept, dreamed, and occasionally suffered insomnia, just like we do. Their rituals, strange as they may seem, were efforts to wrestle control over something inherently uncontrollable. And maybe that's the lesson. Sleep is universal, human, and utterly essential. So, dim your lights, fluff your pillows, and allow yourself to drift gently into the night. Let the whispers of history, the oddities of monarchs, the rituals of centuries, and the comfort of modern bedding carry you into a calm, restful slumber. Good night. Sleep well. And remember, humans have been trying to get it right for thousands of years, and still, it remains a delightful mystery.